Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Although we are almost a week into October already, deep into the celebration of Victober, today I want to tell you just a little bit about what I read in late September. I'm going to try to keep this relatively short because I'm in the midst of two things. First, preparing my house for a period of recovery after shoulder surgery when I will have only the use of my non dominant arm for a few months. And then, secondly, and far more pleasantly, reading as much Victorian literature as I can before I go in for said surgery. I hope to talk a bit about that reading in just a few days. First, let me tell you a little bit about the National Book Festival, held in Washington, D.C.'s very large convention center. I'm not sure I've ever seen so many readers in one spot before. I arrived when the festival opened, and I got to see a couple of panels. The first featured Geraldine Brooks, interviewed by the books editor of the Washington Post, John Williams. Brooks talked about her recent book, Memorial Days, which I don't think I've discussed here. I've mentioned that I read a large number of grief memoirs, and this is certainly one of them, perhaps one of the best written ones I've read in some time. For those of you who don't know, her spouse, the author Tony Horwitz, died suddenly and unexpectedly. Brooks writes what is essentially a braided narrative, one strand about the initial moments and days after her husband's death, and the other about her decision to spend some time a couple of years later in a relatively deserted place that meant a lot to her. At some point, probably not for a while, I'll make a video about a whole bunch of grief memoirs, and I'll definitely go into more detail about Brooks' book then, too. The day after the festival, I pulled up my ebook copy of Memorial Days and reread it. I'm really glad I did. When I first read it, when it first came out, I was most absorbed in the storyline of how she dealt with the immediate impacts of her spouse's death, both the emotional responses, but also all the horrific paperwork she suddenly had crashing down on her with no preparation. This time, I thought far more about her time alone later, a time when she gave herself the space to grieve and to do some healing too. She read old journals her husband had written throughout much of his life, journals she had not read before, and immersed herself in memories that brought her some real sadness, but also profoundly deep pleasure. But back to the festival. The second panel I saw at the book festival was an amazing group of former National Poet Laureates, Joe Harjo, Ada Limon, and my very favorite of these three, Tracy K. Smith, who I've had the great pleasure of getting to see several times over the last few years. The program was moderated by the always entertaining book critic Ron Charles, and all three laureates read new poems and also talked with each other about the projects they each undertook during the particular years they served at the Library of Congress. I didn't realize it, but laureates are not required to create an outreach-oriented project during their year, but it's become quite traditional. Ada Limon, who served during the height of the COVID pandemic, arranged for a series of nature poems to be installed outdoors in national parks. One of my favorite contemporary American poets, Natasha Trethewey, who wasn't on this panel but was a poet laureate a little earlier, talked about how poetry addresses a variety of social issues, etc. Later in the day, there were many authors I really wanted to hear speak. The historian Jill Lepore on her new book about the Constitution, biographer Ron Chernow on his study of Mark Twain, and Daniel Mendelsohn on his new translation of Homer's Odyssey, but sadly I couldn't stay that day. So let's get on to some of my other September reading, most of which was related to various BookTube events. One was Framed in September, the Art Readathon. The book I read in the latter part of the month for this was Julia Voss's biography of Hilma F. Klint. I picked it up on a total lark when I ran across it on my library's digital site, and I found it utterly fascinating. Born in the mid-19th century, she was a Swedish artist, and she claimed to be a clairvoyant at a time when mystical religious beliefs and practices were quite popular, from spiritual meditation to Rudolf Steiner's theosophy. Hilma af Klint was educated in traditional art, but even early on, she seems to have connected art with what she said was communication with the spirit world. She and a few friends would try to commune with supernatural high masters, asking for artistic guidance. And soon, when she was in her 40s, she was producing esoteric, colorful, abstract art. And she believed she gained access to these ideas or visions via spiritualism, essentially. Some of her art was of a typical size, but much of it was enormous. And all of this was well before artists like Kandinsky or Mondrian were producing their abstract work. Her work, it seems, was inspired by something a bit different from the modernism that later abstract artists produced. Let me show you just a bit of Hilma af Klint's work. Okay, another great reading event in September was October, when we read about octopuses and other cephalopods. In the latter part of the month, I read from two different nonfiction works. One I felt pretty blah about, and one I loved, although I didn't finish it and decided to put it aside until after the busy excitement of October winds down. The first was The Soul of an Octopus by Cy Montgomery. I mentioned in my TBR that my husband was very much not fond of this book. My memory of our discussion is that he criticized the anthropomorphism in the book. Now that I've read it, I suspect I misunderstood his critique. Certainly, what I myself disliked about the book was not anthropomorphism, but anthropocentrism. The author doesn't treat the octopuses as if they were humans with human attributes. Instead, she's concentrating more on humans that are part of the story rather than on octopuses. Perhaps this is an overstatement, but the storyline often seems to revolve around what humans learn as opposed to how octopuses live. Last time I talked about octopus books, I mentioned the novel Remarkably Bright Creatures, and these two fit together in interesting ways. In fact, I can't imagine that the novelist Shelby Van Pelt hadn't read Cy Montgomery's book and felt deeply inspired by it to write her own. At any rate, I wasn't especially moved by it, but I also wasn't terribly disappointed by it, possibly because my spouse's old critique had left me with low expectations. So then I picked up another nonfiction book about octopuses, Other Minds by Peter Godfrey Smith, and really enjoyed his more analytical approach. As I said earlier, I didn't get that far into it, but it will probably reappear in November. James at Quaint and Curious Volumes made a wonderful video discussing it more fully, which I'll try to remember to link to down below. On to the third September readathon. For this year's Shake-Temper, that time when BookTube focuses on the writing of and about William Shakespeare, I read two contemporary novels that are Shakespeare adjacent. But before I talk about them, let me share with you the Shakespeare-adjacent tea I'm drinking today, which is A Midsummer Night's Tea from Harney & Sons Fine Teas in collaboration with Shakespeare's Globe. I believe the theater receives 10% of the sale price of each tin. I really like this blend of black tea with orange peel and ginger and rose petals and bergamot oil, among other flavors, and I love how Harney advertises it. This is a complex blend, they say. Should it be anything else? I'll leave an affiliate link to Harney & Sons down in the description box. But sadly, I don't seem to have a Shakespeare mug. I think I may have to remedy that sometime soon. So instead, it's my October mug. Anyway, on to the Shakespeare-adjacent books. Initially, I planned to read The Owl Was a Baker's Daughter by Grace Tiffany, but it really focuses on the life of Shakespeare's daughter much later in life, when she flees Stratford. I realized that what I really want to read first is My Father Had a Daughter, about Judith Shakespeare's youth, before I start this follow-up. And I couldn't lay my hands on it this month, perhaps next Shakespeare. So instead, I read Boy by Nicole Galland. This story revolves around two main characters. One is Sander Cook, one of the boy players in Shakespeare's acting troupe. As a very young man, he was a beloved actor who played female roles at a time when actual women were not allowed to be on stage. But at the beginning of the book, he's becoming an adult man, and he realizes that his career and livelihood are in danger, as is his whole sense of worth, and maybe even his sense of self. The other main character is Joan, a young woman who seeks a more advanced education in natural philosophy, an education that's not really available to women. It is through disguise that she finds a way to join in the salons where intellectuals discuss their ideas. In other words, the boy of the title and the cover could refer to both characters. Major historical figures from the Elizabethan period cross the pages of this novel. There's everyone from Shakespeare and Richard Burbage, as you might expect, to natural philosopher Francis Bacon, respected and trusted by Queen Elizabeth, and Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, not always so trusted by Queen Elizabeth. This is a fast and easy read, sometimes sort of a nerdy thriller, and sometimes basically a romance. It won't be going on my best of the year reads, not that there is such a list here, but I did enjoy it. And beyond just the entertaining plot, there is a deeper theme. Fundamentally, as the cover of the book basically says, Boy is about the roles people choose to play on the world stage, especially when society's expectations or society's accepted behavior is limited in some way. The other Shakespeare-adjacent book I read this month was Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I mentioned it in my last Reads and Rambles, although at that point I had only read the first part of it. One of the things I talked about was how beautiful the writing is, especially in comparison to a couple of other contemporary novels I had been reading during that same week. My love of the writing continued throughout the book, and I appreciated the basic plot line and the theme of how grief affects a marriage in general. I did have a few hesitations, the major one being that I wasn't convinced by the main character's nearly magical sort of nature sprite portrayal. But honestly, it was reasonably done and emphasized her sense of difference from the people around her. And then, before I finished the book, I got to have a chat about the book over dinner one night with a new friend who knows a great deal about Shakespeare. Let me back up and say I've mentioned a few times on the channel that I have no hesitations about hearing so-called spoilers. And after I told my dinner companion not to hold back, she pointed out a couple of really fascinating things. And I'm hesitant to spill the beans given that the points are not only her ideas rather than mine, but also because they entail spoilers that I know many of you would prefer not to hear. So let me allude to two broad ideas. One is that she saw how a standard Shakespearean device was put into the plot of Hamnet in a clever way. I had not caught it myself, but I really should have. Email or Voxer me if you've read the novel and want to know what I'm talking about. And the other, she pointed out that O'Farrell chose not to use a particular historical reality in the ending. And the author's choice actually simplified the main character's emotional response, and therefore made the ending both less subtle and less emotionally powerful than it might have been had O'Farrell stuck to what would have actually been true. My apologies for being a little obscure here, but my larger point is that I know all of you have also had these kinds of conversations with other readers about other books in real life as well as here on BookTube, where someone sees things in a book that allow you to go further yourself. And I've been thinking about that a lot. That feeling, I guess I've always had, that even though reading is one of the most private experiences many of us get during our days, reading is also communal. And talking about what we're reading builds friendships. And having conversations with other readers expands how we think about books, both specific books and books and reading in general. I saw that over dinner that evening, and I saw it at the National Book Festival, and of course I see it every time I pull up a BookTube video. Thank you for joining me today. See you again soon here on Hannah's Books.